So there you are, swimming in a pool, playing a game of Marco Polo with your friends. You shout, Marco, and you hear, Polo, Marco, Polo, Marco, Polo. And just as you're getting closer, the sound of your friends sounds like it's always the same distance away. Are you actually getting closer? Is the information helping you make better decisions, or are you lost in the deep end? This is the problem economies face when it comes to broad macro statistics like those that come out of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, aka the BLS. And it's an issue that the National Bureau of Economic Research tried to look at in a working paper titled The Value of Reliable Statistics by Bloom et al. They looked at the uncertainty effect of President Trump's firing of the head of the BLS in August 2025, and then they make a back of the envelope calculation of the economic value of reliable official statistics. So today we thought we'd give an eye to their methodology and claims, and then try and tease out what part of the paper is actually working. Hello and welcome to Of Significance, the podcast where the stuff that counts and the stuff that matters are the same. I'm your everyman host, Brent Buck, right here with two data experts who knew about big data before it got big, Dr. Nathan Woods and Dr. Steve Bronars. Steve, Nathan, how are you?
Doing very well.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
You know, I noticed I said Marco and I didn't hear you guys say Polo. I just feel like if we're going to be playing the game, you got to jump in.
Well, I was out of the water.
Okay. So the only way to begin is by beginning. So Steve, do you mind giving us a little insight what this paper is about and what the authors are trying to do?
Yes. Thanks, Brent. What the paper is about is a follow-up to an earlier study that's relating a measure of policy, economic policy uncertainty to economic outcomes. And the idea behind that earlier paper is that when there's more uncertainty about the way in which policy is going to play out, there's less hiring, less investment, less GDP growth. And they, in that earlier paper, worked on coming up with an index of that uncertainty and then relaying it to the measured economic outcomes. Here, they're looking at it and saying, can we figure out how much the firing of the head of the BLS and the implied threats to the autonomy of the BLS that might have gone along with that could impact uncertainty about future economic information and policy, and also lead to reduced economic activity, hiring, less investment. And so that was the goal. There's no doubt, if you look at their paper, that there was a big jump in their policy uncertainty index in August of 2025. The question is, why did that happen? And how much of that might have been accounted for by the firing of the BLS commissioner? And then in dollar terms, what would it mean for the economy, that event? It's kind of an event study that they're looking at before and after. How did this look? And so that's kind of the point of the paper, to try to come up with some dollar value associated with kind of the reliability and integrity of the data coming out of the BLS.
So Nathan, I want to jump to you because I feel like we all broadly have a sense for how important good stats are and the danger of uncertainty. But I'm curious, if you have any good reasons why this all matters.
Well, yeah, I mean, let's hope it all matters. I think, this is one set of data for the BLS. They obviously the products that they put out go cover a wide swath of economic activity. We use their data all the time, as far as, estimating unemployment durations and how long it might take somebody to catch up in earnings. I think businesses use this information in terms of all their decision making. I think the underlying thinking about this would be, if I can't believe those numbers, and as Steve pointed out, I'm feeling less confident about making some of those investments because I'm not sure how it's all going to play out, and I sit on the sidelines, then that can have long-term consequences for all of us. In terms of like the data that we actually use, we are concerned if it's not available to us or if it takes a while to come out. And then we've talked about on previous podcasts the revisions, the reasons for the revisions. I think we're pretty careful about giving the BLS a hard time because it's a challenging thing that they try to do. But it's a problem if people are thinking they can't believe in the data that the BLS is going to be publishing. So that uncertainty, whether it's in the moments after, somebody gets fired and all the kind of political hoo-ha that happens right after that, or if it's sort of more of a sustainable lack of confidence longer term, those are all things that we would be worried about.
Well, yeah, I think that's a good point about the difficulty the BLS faces, because I think it's also probably worth mentioning at this point, doing economic analyses in general is tough, especially in the macro world. So whatever we say here, we don't want to come down too hard on the authors for having limitations that are just impossible to get around, and they're trying to do the best they can with what they have. But Steve, jumping back to the details of the paper, what was their methodology? Because as I understand it, the big focus is this kind of index of uncertainty. How do they come up with this, and what are they using it for?
Right. And so the index of uncertainty that Bloom and some of his co-authors, Steve Davis and others at Stanford, have come up with, and they have a website with it. They've been doing this for years, and they're tracking news coverage of economic stories that are talking about things that you associate with the policy uncertainty. And so it's really an index of, using probably machine learning and AI and looking for keywords, things that are associated with economic uncertainty, and when that trends up or down, how it relates to what's going to happen with our measured economic output. So it's really it's taking a bunch of words that show up in newspapers and news coverage and relating it to a number and just saying, did the number go up 10%, whatever. So in August of 2025, it jumped like 50%. There was so much coverage of things that were related to economic uncertainty, a huge jump. Part of what they do in the paper is they say, well, the BLS is always revising numbers, and that was really the precipitating reason given by the White House to fire McIntyre for inaccurate, too many revisions. And the relationship between this economic uncertainty index and revisions by the BLS is relatively modest. And what the paper also shows is that there are always going to be jumps in economic uncertainty whenever the BLS revises its numbers. Why would they revise their numbers on a month-to-month basis? Because of the slow reporting of the businesses being surveyed. But that is a relatively modest change in uncertainty that would typically happen as the revisions are larger and smaller. And what we saw in August of 2025 was a huge jump over and above what you might expect from just, a slightly bigger revision to employment totals than we would usually have.
So the BLS, and we've talked about this many times, is always revising its numbers because it takes a lot of time for different companies to submit, here are the number of people who are working for us at any point in time. Sometimes businesses go under and we don't have a good accounting for that. That you're saying the shock here is normally pretty small. How can you tell that it's the firing versus people realizing that whatever the trend they thought was occurring in the economy was still occurring, that job numbers weren't changing?
Right. Great question, because what they found in the paper is that the job numbers...
Thank you.
The job numbers changed a little bit, but not enough to cause a 50% jump in this index that they have. So they relate the two. They find that there's usually not a big, this wasn't an unprecedented change in the revisions. And what would usually happen would be the policy index would jump. This jumped much, much more than that. So the question is, how much is it due to this event, right? And because we have this, they run a regression relating the uncertainty index to revisions, and they go, okay, that explains some of it. But there's this huge residual jump that we can't explain from our very simple regression. And it's like most of the jump in the uncertainty index. And so the question is, what else happened in early August that we could account for? And rather than doing it in a more statistical regression way, they relied on the same kind of news information, Google searches that included Erica McIntyre's name, BLS, with the uncertainty, and saying, well, the story that talked both about her and about the economic uncertainty will attribute to her. And if it didn't, then it's something else. And by doing that, they came up with this measure that 18% of the hits on the internet included her. And so 18% of this jump is related to her departure. Yeah, you could question that assumption or not. It's hard to do, but that's kind of what they did.
And so just to back up just a tiny bit, because I think the whole thing with these event studies, right, is that the thing that you think is causing, the outcome happens, and you can show that in some way, but then you're worried about what other confounding factors might have gone on. And one of those confounding factors for sure would be the job revisions on their own. And
which
so
they
figured out
for it. Yes.
So they figured out how to account for that. And I think that was like 7% of the difference or something like that, but not a ton. And it kind of consistent with what you were saying, it's sort of a small impact. And then there was this other, which is kind of amazing, right? That on the same day, a governor of the Federal Reserve resigned.
Kugler. Yeah. Yes.
And so there's some thought that could be another factor, and they accounted for that in some way also, I think, right?
Right. And I think it's a really good point that you bring up, like these event studies, because a lot of times you go, well, this event happened on that day or that week, we'll look before and after. And we're not even trying to then parcel it out. We're going, the before and after is due to that event. And here they're trying to say, well, it wasn't all due to that. And they give a range of estimates, but I think their most conservative one says like 18% of the jump. 18% of the giant jump, what we think was due to the dismissal of the head of the BLS. So suppose the jump in the index was only that much, not the whole thing. How much would that have lowered GDP and employment growth and all that stuff? And that's kind of the approach they take, which is, again, more conservative in saying, well, everything that we couldn't explain with the revisions themselves, the 93% that you were talking about, Nathan, maybe all of it was due to her. They're not going with that. They're going, let's be conservative and do that. But I think it's kind of a different way of doing it, because it's not like, let's run a regression and control for other stuff. It's like we have this measure, and then we're going to look at it with data from internet searches and stories and decide if the story didn't mention her, that is not going to count in the same way as if the story did mention her.
So as I understand it, this index is created by Bloom and his co-authors, right?
Right. His co-authors in a different paper, not on this one, but he had a couple co-authors on that. And they have a website out there that you can look at it, and they publish like what's going on with economic uncertainty. And I think it's got a pretty good track record of correlating with how the economy is going to go.
Yeah. So I guess my question was going to be, is it possible that there's some other factor that's not included in their uncertainty measure that could be driving it in some way?
That's a good question. Yeah.
And of course, that's going to be a problem in any statistic you produce. But I guess what you're saying here is, well, it does a decent job of leading where the market is going to be going.
Yeah, I think it does. And the idea behind it always was, if you look at that original paper, we're going to talk about economic policy, but there's all sorts of uncertainty about, and economists always can relate it back to the economy and dollars and cents, but there could be legal uncertainty about interpretations of laws. There could be foreign policy uncertainty. There could be all sorts of different things. I think if you go back and look at their original paper, they're trying to focus more in on like what the Federal Reserve is doing and other, federal economic, fiscal, monetary policy, as opposed to maybe more general societal, uncertainty about crime or, like I said, some of these other things, foreign policy, unless it impacts in some way in the story, some, economic effects of it, which maybe a lot of stories ultimately get to that. And so I think it's a question of how they built this thing. But it seems to me there would be other indexes you could come up with about how uncertain things are are looking that wouldn't be super highly correlated with theirs, probably, somewhat correlated, but would be measuring some different things as well.
So I think you did some calculations with the underlying data to try and evaluate how important this effect was. What is it you try to look at?
So
That's an excellent question, Brent.
Excellent question, Brent.
Thank you.
So the revisions that you get, even though they're in some ways you might consider substantial, I calculated on average in the last few years, it's been between 47 and 48,000 that they would change the estimate of what the job growth was from 1 month to the next for the same month. So they go, hey, we think we know what employment was in April. And then as time passes, we go, we got a better idea now that more results are in. That was kind of the early returns and then the later returns. And you go, okay, that is in the typical kind of growth that we see in the jobs in the U.S., you might expect 2 million jobs added in a year. That's about 170,000 a month. So 47,000 is not zero. But when you realize how hard it is to measure this stuff, there's a lot of noise in the estimates, even after they're all in. And so they'll put a confidence interval around it, a margin of error that's much bigger than even the revision. And so when I looked at the regression that was run in this paper, and I said, suppose we went from 47,000 to like twice that, 94,000. How much would that cost in GDP to recognize that, we were off by that amount? And it's like 4 or 5 billion in GDP compared to, I think they estimated 18 or 19 billion loss in GDP from the firing of Erica McIntyre. So there'd have to be a pretty, much larger revision than just doubling the revision from 47 to 94 to get close to, assuming everything is could be linearly extrapolated, to what they estimate was the consequence to the U.S. economy of firing the commissioner of the BLS. That's 18 or 19 million, as I recall. Really, if there was an unusually big revision and people go like, what's going on? It might cost 4 or 5 billion if you use their same methodology.
Right. And they take that, they calculate an 18 or 19 billion dollar loss to the economy from the firing of the commissioner. And then they divide into that the budget for the BLS and say, well, for every dollar we spend on the BLS, that's $25 worth of economic value that's being created. I know that's a back of the envelope calculation, but what do we think of that approach, and how sensitive of a metric do you think that's going to be? Is it worthwhile to even think about it that way?
I think it's like almost impossible to measure, but there's a sense in which, and I don't know if you would agree with this or not, Nathan, but let's say the BLS is spending 700 million, and then by firing the commissioner of the BLS, you reduced the value of what they're doing, but not all the way to zero, right? They're still going to be producing stuff. I think the ratio of the 700 million is almost too much. It's like firing the head of the BLS. Let's say just cut in half the value of what you're spending. Why wouldn't you divide by the 350 million that you basically dismantled by this action? I think that it's hard for me to wrap my head around what that ratio really means, but there's part of me that says, you're almost saying like we don't have a BLS anymore after we fired the commissioner. I think it's easier for them to argue the firing of the commissioner might have cost the economy $19 billion, but I'm not sure it reduced how that relates to the 700 million, because there's still a BLS, even with a new commissioner, might not be viewed as effectively. We've still got a building.
We still have a building. They're still writing up papers.
The staff still does what they're doing. They're not political appointees, and they do what they always do.
Right. So for a couple of thoughts on that. One, she was likely substantially underpaid, right?
Most likely, yeah.
If her firing cost us, all that money. No, I mean, I think what they're trying to do is obviously it's almost, what Steve said, it's almost impossible to do this, but they're trying to make a point that if you are going to relate these two numbers, there is value in the investment we place in the BLS. There's value in the data and the reporting that they put out. And if you are going to undermine that value by causing people to lack confidence in that, then you're not going to see that return on the investment that you would have. So I appreciate the effort. I don't think they're overstating necessarily the relationship. I think they're kind of trying to give you that back of the envelope. And I think maybe it's even, I think maybe they say this. We don't know how long this effect persists. I think, in a lot of these event studies, traditionally you're looking at something, it's happening, it will have the impact, and then it is gone. It may not persist forever. And here, if the outcome really is a lack of confidence, so maybe it's even going to be more expensive. It's not going to be a one-shot deal. At this point, either the people who did not believe in the BLS numbers to begin with, or used to believe in the BLS numbers and don't any longer, if that's a larger group out there, a larger share of all the people that are consuming this stuff, or people like us who are kind of downstream from those who consume this stuff, that's a real problem. And so maybe it's even larger, Steve. I guess that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was saying, that the 700 million experiment to me, would be like, let's just abolish the BLS and then see what happens to the, right? That would be what you would do, to say, what was that 700 million worth? We're going to shut the whole thing down. How's your uncertainty index going to spike after that? Right? Like, just firing the head is almost like, obviously it was related to some of that spike in the index, but that's what I was just like, the entire budget compared to that, it's kind of an interesting comparison. But I think you would agree with me that we just abolished the BLS, the uncertainty index might spike even more than it did.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think there's something that's interesting about firing, in particular, someone like the head of an organization, and the reason that you do it. Because if it seems like a highly partisan thing, even if you had a bunch of people in the organization who are nonpartisan, everything that goes through now starts to seem a little bit more questionable. It seems like more decisions might be related to partisan decision making, as opposed to, we're just trying to be good data stewards. And I kind of wonder, this is a pretty eye-catching number of the $25 of value from the BLS. But to Nathan's point, it might be understating things, because the thing that isn't being valued really is the BLS. It's certainty. That if you got rid of the entire BLS, you certainly would see that uncertainty level spike. Whatever that uncertainty is going to be much more important, over the long term than just the whatever snapshot you're taking, look at for the economy.
Yeah. Are you suggesting we run an experiment where we abolish the BLS, see what happens, and then go, we were just kidding?
I mean, it's not the first time we've suggested insane experiments on this podcast.
But I agree with both of you guys. I'm saying that the $19 billion impact that they're measuring, if you believe that, it was attributable to some kind of diminution of what the BLS is doing, but it wasn't making what they were doing worth zero. So I don't see why you would attribute, like, we've just lost 700 million because we've got someone else running the BLS. All due respect to the former commissioner, it's like, okay, even the most skeptical people would say we've diminished what it can do, but we didn't diminish it by 700 million. So that's why I'm just saying, I don't understand that ratio, because maybe we diminished it only by 100 million or 200 or 350 million. And then you get a very different ratio.
Yeah, I think if we can get, $25 for every dollar we put into the BLS, that to me says we should make a second BLS to compete with the first.
A second BLS.
We should be cranking out BLS after BLS.
So it's like
I know that the
money machine right there. Yeah.
I know that the BLS has the ability to benchmark to more reliable administrative data at different points in time. Steve, this is something that you've talked about before, but I guess I'm curious, is this just a technological problem with getting accurate numbers? If we had more sophisticated systems, could we get the answer? Or is it, a human nature issue that we're just so impatient?
Right. And I do think that there is a serious problem that needs addressing. And when we're talking about this event of the firing of the BLS commissioner, we should note that in the fall of each year is when they announce how they think the benchmarking is going to go. The benchmarking doesn't happen until like February of the next year. So they'll announce this in like August or September of 2026, and then it'll actually happen in 2027. The last two times they've done it, what they're trying to line up is like the total employment based on what the surveys have been telling us, with this administrative data coming from unemployment insurance companies that pay into the unemployment insurance system, which is a very reliable kind of census of how many employees do you have, how many businesses are there. And the big difference between the survey and the census benchmark is there could be births and deaths of businesses. So when you're doing the survey, if somebody stops responding, it could be because they decided to not respond anymore, or they closed down their business. And then there are other businesses are starting up and they have employees and they're not in your survey frame, so you don't pick them up. The last two times they've done this, in 2024 and 2025, the revision for this benchmarking has been 800 or 900,000, which, like I said, there's 159 million people on payroll. It's, less than 1%. It's like 0.6% of that total. But relative to the 2 or 3 million job gains we thought, we're like way off. And so if we had more administrative data we could get in real time, we would not have these giant revisions and make it seem like we're gaining jobs, and then realize, no, actually, we weren't doing that well. Now, it's not the problem. The BLS do the best they can on these birth-death models, but it's hard. And it's even harder when businesses don't respond at the same rate as they used to. And as the economy gets more dynamic, it gets harder. Ideally, I think it'd be great if you could tie into that administrative data more than just once a year and do it quarterly or something. And then there wouldn't be this big surprise at the end of like, wow, we were off by 800,000, which seems to me like a lot when you thought, hey, we gained 3 million jobs. You go, no, it's 2.2 million, not 3.
Well, and we've made this point before, but I think there is some responsibility on the people that are taking in this information from the BLS not to ignore some of that kind of margin of error that I think the BLS is reasonably, it's not like they're hiding the ball, that there won't be these kinds of revisions and the challenges of getting the right numbers out there. And so I think it's up to the media and the politicians to be a little bit responsible in the reporting of this stuff too.
We need a blue ribbon bipartisan a blue ribbon bipartisan group looking. I mean, it's a serious thing, because I think what this paper is showing is that reliable statistics are valuable for decision makers, policy makers, all that. And you could say, just be patient. We'll eventually know from the census how many jobs were created in the last year. But it comes out with a real lag compared to these surveys that they do, every month. And so I think, to me, that's really the question of how could we speed that up? Because it's a fairly knowable number if you had your hands on the administrative data. Everybody's doing their payrolls electronically. The information is out there. How can we get it, or increase the response rates or something? Because even increasing the response rates, though, there are always new businesses forming and businesses that are failing. So it's that's what's really accounting for, I'd say, the biggest revisions are really coming from the births and deaths that we only fix once a year.
So the current BLS commissioner is Brent Matsumoto. If he was fired and you were magically made the commissioner, what would be the one change you would implement for the BLS? Mine would be, I would have, instead of reporting, the monthly jobs numbers, it's jobs threat levels. So it's a threat level green, threat level orange, threat level red, and we just don't tell people the specifics, but allow them to worry.
There are a lot of different things that I think they could do better, but related to stuff that we're talking about, I think Nathan is right that while if you read the fine print, you realize when we report this number, it's our best estimate, but there's a pretty large margin of error. And so when they say how many jobs have been added in a month from the previous month, the 95% confidence interval is like 165,000. And so I think in the most recent jobs reports, we've been having 100,000 jobs added. And subject to these revisions that we've been talking about, even if the 100,000 was the best they could do and there were no revisions, it's still based on a sample of a huge economy. And so it could be anywhere from a decline of 65,000 to plus 265. So I would try to focus more on we want to give you the data as quickly as we can, but we really don't understand it as well as we would like until we have a little bit of time to process it. And like for GDP, they do that quarterly, and the BLS are just doing this stuff monthly. Unemployment insurance claims are doing weekly, and we're just addicted to this, getting the data as quickly as we can, and it's just impossible to have the same level of precision when you're trying to report it that quickly. So that's what I think they should think about, how they could do a better job of transmitting that information to take it with the proper
What about you, Nate?
margin of error.
What about you, Nathan?
Well,
do you
yeah,
do it quarterly? Do you pay businesses to respond in a prompt manner?
Well, this year, it's the 250th anniversary of America. I would say it's your patriotic duty to answer the survey. And if you're not answering the survey, you're not doing your part. If that poor person, if they took him out of the job and put somebody like us in there, I'm just trying to figure out the increased value associated with the BLS as a result of that. Is that because of him leaving or one of us joining?
That's right. I would say one thing. You made me think of that when you were talking. When I've looked at the revisions, they're tiny for the government agencies because the BLS reports private and public. The government agencies respond to the survey or maybe just say, here's our data. And so they're very, very small revisions to state and local and federal employment compared to the private sector. So part of it is maybe paying them to respond or appealing to their sense of like, hey, this is kind of important stuff, respond. Because it's possible to have small revisions. And I mean, not just small revisions, the monthly, but of course, the birth and death it's not sure what that means for the government entities, but I'm sure there are new departments and departments that go away. So the revisions are small for government employment.
Steve, would you say that maybe part of the solution then is just more government employees?
The government should take over everything, and then we would have low revisions. No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that it's possible to do it, and I'm not sure what they're doing. They could say what is it that causes those revisions to be small in percentage terms? Obviously, the private sector much bigger than the government, but like in percentage terms, the revisions are pretty tiny. Yeah.
Well, as always, when we evaluate a paper, we like to give it a grade. What do you guys think the grade of is on this one? And you can add as many qualifiers for why you're giving that grade.
It was a really interesting topic. I think almost impossible to really come up with a super convincing methodology to do this. I give him an A for effort. I wasn't totally convinced by it, but if you think there's a better way to do it, people can go out there and measure something different.
Yeah, I don't think they were taking my class for a grade, so I'm just going to say pass.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that having something at least somewhat substantive to add value to the discussion is worth it on its own. I don't know what the return is on that discussion, but it's one we should be having. We're going to keep monitoring these kinds of changes. And as always, we're going to advocate for having better, more reliable official statistics. This breaking news just came across my desk. It does seem that the commissioner was fired, and it looks like I have been named the new commissioner. So watch it, everyone. It's going to be job threat level orange coming up very soon. All right, before we go, Marco,
Polo.
thank you.
Fish out of water.
You know,
Well, that's been this episode of Significance. This episode's been brought to you by Edgeworth Economics, a leader in economic consulting, and with the help of our producers Kimberly Krewald, Ryan Deal, and Brian McLemara of Brand Ready Media, with music by Armwell Lang. Thanks for listening, StatPack, and always remember to check your assumptions.